Hello everyone, welcome back to Maritime SoftwareHub, the People Podcast. Today I'm really delighted to be joined by Claire Georgeson, and she's going to run through why seafarers are your asset and not just a cost. So Claire, thank you so much for joining us. You're the founder and CEO of PsyFyi. Please can you introduce yourself and obviously tell us a bit more about your background?
Thanks, Callum. A little bit about me. So, Claire Georgeson, I'm the CEO and the founder of PsyFyi, self-proclaimed CEO, I'll have you know, which is the benefit of when you set up your own company. Yeah. My background is predominantly commercial shipping. So I spent a number of years working for a variety of different owners and operators on the chartering side and the operations side, which in essence is just basically asset management for the owner. So making very rich men and women around the world even richer, which is absolutely great. PsyFyi is, I would say, it's a bit of a pious project, or at least that's how it started out. And what we do is we collect data directly from the seafarers. We do this through our product, which is called CQ. And in essence, what it is just pretty much, I would say it's a way of getting the seafarers' voices heard in a relevant time period and really what is important to them. So we will work with the owners and the operators to really look at what their pinch points are. And then we will use these questions to ask the seafarers. And what we're trying to do is build up a bit of a profile of their life on board, but looking at risk, safety, efficient and effective working. And then we then guide the owners with the data that we see once we anonymize it so that they really get a sense of where the pinch points, where the gaps are, and also the things that are happening very successfully as well on board.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I mean, really interesting to go through your background there. It looks like you've obviously got exposure to the shipbroking side. You've then got in-house in chartering vessels and things. So what was it? Has anything kind of specifically prompted you to start up the business? Were there any kind of inefficiencies that you spotted that thought that you wanted to obviously take action?
Yeah, yes and no. So when I first sort of started my career, you'll know this when you're quite young, it's a job. And you become exposed to kind of a business acumen really of what everybody else is sort of having their real world experiences with. But I started to see, I would say sort of in my late 20s, that there was a big disconnect between the ship and the shore, not so much in terms of its sort of processes, but a little bit in terms of its value proposition. So we know that we invest in a lot of tech, we invest in a lot of solutions for the actual asset side themselves. So we know how efficiently the vessels are working, we know how efficiently the cargoes are working, we know where the vessels are, we know the best routes to take, we know the best speeds. But we don't really do that with the human element. And I sort of hypothesized that it's probably because it's quite difficult. And also maybe there's this belief that the value isn't there. Is there really a purpose in understanding how people operate? And if you do understand that, can you actually get more value from that? And I thought there's probably somewhere in the middle of that you can have value to an owner or an operator where they can understand really what the pinch points are, but then also value back to the seafarer because you can elevate their welfare and their well-being by really tackling the problems that they see day to day rather than just assuming to know what they are.
Exactly right. And we've actually featured a few kind of crewing software platforms, I would say, on the show here, and it's really fantastic what you're focusing on, and it does just drive hopefully the happiness and the welfare of the seafarers themselves, which is really important. And I noticed you said that you predominantly use anonymous data, which I think is obviously massive for the crew themselves. They don't want to get themselves in trouble or jeopardize what they're doing, so that's really interesting. And how do you then go about gathering the feedback and the insights from the crew themselves? What's your sort of approach?
Yeah, one of the kind of fundamentals of what we do is the anonymity of it, because if you don't have anonymous data, then we don't have a business source. So it was really, really important for us at the beginning to really protect the seafarers. But then equally from the owner's perspective, where is the value of these sort of anonymous kind of data packages, these big data sets of anonymous voices? So we kind of looked into the market of what there was. So you have the happiness index by Mission to Seafarers that a lot of people are very familiar with, which gives a really great snapshot on what is happening, but it doesn't really pinpoint, the populations and the behaviours and the, sort of the value bases. So whilst we collect, let's say, individual seafarers' voices, within that is anonymised, but we also collect population data as well. So we look at rank, we look at gender where applicable, we will look at sort of age groups, we also look at nationalities. And what we're trying to do within that is to feed that data back to the owner where they can start looking at, okay, for example, if I have a crew of 25 people and I'm operating an LNG vessel and half of my crew are under the age of 30 and the other half of my crew are over the age of 45, what are the fundamental differences between them? Because those two group sets and age groups will have very different ways of, for example, their expectations, their value bases, their passions, their loves, why are they doing this as a job? And you can't really have a one-size-fits-all solution for both of these. So that's the predominant basis of our data, is even though it is anonymous, we do have population data within that, and also ship-specific data. So we know the types of vessels, whether they're ballast or they're laden, which part of the world they're in, which cargoes they carry, are they in port or they're at sea? And that just helps us kind of build up a really robust data sort of visual and actually what is happening on board.
Okay, and who are you mainly providing this data and insights to? Is it the crew planner, the crewing managers for vessel owners, or is it a layer above that as well, the kind of decision make C-suite, or everyone?
Yeah, I think it's both really. It really depends on the structure of the organisation, because what we do, I think, is quite high level. We do end up cross-pollinating with the C-suites, which is really interesting because, we always say, what keeps you awake at night if this is your company? So if you're perhaps a legacy owner and you've got a reputation, you've got a history to really protect, you do need to have a finger on the pulse. And some of the sort of, I would say, the traditional sort of methods of seafaring. So perhaps you had, let's say, a grandpa that went to sea, and then it would be the father, then the son, and you'd sort of expect it to run through the families. That model is sort of breaking down a little bit. So our data becomes quite interesting to the crew managers and the operations people and people who are dealing with the actual human element day to day. But equally, I think it's also quite interesting for the CEOs. So a lot of the times when we present our findings, we will have someone of a C-suite in the room with us, which is really exciting because it means that we're getting the data and the information is being passed to the right people that can actually make real tangible changes.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess in terms of those, like the value of getting that insights back to the decision makers is really key. So, is there a way that we can try and change the industry's perspective, like through your kind of data and findings? Do you find?
We hope so. Interestingly enough, so whilst I was working in commercial shipping, I did sort of pivot and I moved into an organisation that is basically known as conglomerate for the tanker industry, and sort of looks at what is of interest, what's important for the tanker market as a whole. And I was really interested. I think this was very much pre-SyFyi. So this was just as my ideas were sort of forming on what I thought was important within the industry, but I didn't quite land on what that looked like. So, data collection for seafarers, I was sort of hovering perhaps around the more reactive services. And what I found, which was really interesting, is that a lot of the kind of the market, perhaps they have a basic understand, or they have a very, very in-depth understanding of how the industry works, but their focus isn't usually on the human element. And I think that's because seafaring is so fragmented, and it's often controlled, or it's often assumed that you'll have a manning agent or a third-party manager. You don't have to have it in-house, you can outsource it. So from our perspective, with what we're trying to achieve, it's really that educational part. And it's also, I would say, to kind of encourage the smaller owners that are really, really dependent on third-party managers sometimes, and also don't really have a crewing strategy for the 5, 10, 15 years that they might need for the length of the vessel, to really consider that you can have that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with collecting data from your seafarers, as long as you do it responsibly, and then use that data to really impact change.
What does that look like in terms of kind of day to day, getting the data from the seafarers? Is it like an online form you would send to them, or is it when they're back on shore you can have a more in-depth conversation with them? How does it typically run?
So we do everything continuously whilst people are on board the vessel. So again, one of the big challenges is that life at sea is, historically, it's been very difficult with connectivity. And the kind of traditional model 15 years ago of receiving your letter in the post that was kind of postmarked a month ago has sort of dwindled out a little bit with the introduction of the internet and Wi-Fi and Starlink. So again, for us to collect valuable information, we really needed to have a sort of a finger on the button with the seafarers, basically every day that they're on board. So we looked at, well, how does the industry currently do this? It tends to be through traditional surveys, pulse surveys, where you get maybe 50 questions that you answer. You might get to sort of question 20 and you're like, oh, fed up of this, and you throw it in the bin. But we were like, we actually wanted to do something similar, but every day in a much shorter period of time. So we basically use social media to ask 1 or 2 or 3 questions each day. Takes 9 seconds for the seafarers to respond to. They have a mixture of quantitative and qualitative replying mechanisms. So they respond with, let's say, a sort of a 1 to 5 scale, which indicates how satisfied or dissatisfied they are with an issue. Yeah. And then the follow-up questions of that then really look into, okay, well, what's the impact of this if you are dissatisfied, or what's the impact of it if you are satisfied? And then the next stage of that is, okay, can you then go into more depth of what is it that makes you dissatisfied, or what is the reason that you are so happy and satisfied with it? So just building up a kind of a storyline, a storyboard of information.
Yeah. Would crewing manager, for example, say, like, okay, maybe we've seen for some reason a number of people not performing or being absent from work, if you can be absent from work on a ship, I don't know, or just something that's not quite right. Would they engage you for a period of time typically, or is the idea to come on board with them and just be like an everyday kind of extension of their manning team, essentially?
Yeah, you can do it both ways, really. So you've kind of got 2 models. We operate a subscription model, so every day for a period of time, so call it 1 year. And our questions are asked in monthly buckets. So every month, the questions will rotate, change slightly, and then we ask the question, because what we're trying to do is build up trend data. So whilst we're collecting the individual opinions and voices of the seafarers, it's also incredibly important for us to understand what's the mean of that, because what you don't want to do is start influencing kind of changes on board the vessel, because the loudest, almost, it's like the loudest dog barks the loudest almost. So we also need to understand, well, what is the actual view of the whole vessel in its totality? And if you have certain outliers, then they can be actioned separately. And then we also have a secondary model where if you have, let's say, a large fleet owner or perhaps a third-party manager who's just really interested in getting a sort of an idea of what is happening on board a vessel, we will do kind of bespoke one-off projects. But what that allows that crew manager or owner to have is a vast amount of data for a 1-month period, which also includes our sort of analysis behind that, access to our sort of benchmarking tools, so that they can just get a sense of, are things looking good on particular types of vessels or across different populations, or perhaps do they need a more long-term strategic plan to perhaps change it?
Yeah, no, okay, fantastic. That makes sense. And of the findings that you've uncovered, I guess, over the last few years, are there any kind of particular misunderstood, maybe insights or inceptions that you've found out?
I think that it's really interesting. So I was actually yesterday. I was in The Hague. I was in the Netherlands, and we were speaking with a lady. She runs a fintech company in the sort of the African countries, and it was really interesting. So her background isn't maritime at all. Her background is financial services, and she was really curious around, I would say, more of the cruise model where young people will go to sea. Perhaps it will be their first job, tax-free, food and board are paid for. It's a great industry. Perhaps at the end of the month you get a big sort of like pocket of money, but a lot of these girls and guys, they're not investing it in pensions, or they're not saving it. So they might do a few years, they then come back to shore, and of course the shore salaries are not reflective of what they were receiving on board. And her perception of seafaring was that it was awful, that all seafarers are abused, that they're all kind of taken advantage of, which is, I would say, reflected by the sort of the typical or the most common labour sources, the Philippines, India, what you would have considered developing countries sort of 5-10 years ago. And actually what our data suggests is that seafarers themselves are generally very satisfied. They enjoy their jobs. They're very good at their jobs. They're capable professionals. And that's how they want to be treated. They want to be treated as the professionals they are. And that isn't just, the top 3 or chief engineers and officers and masters, but that's also your able-bodied seamen as well. They recognise that they do a job, they do it very well, and they're very proud of that. And I would say that's probably one of the biggest takeaways that we have, because a lot of the narrative that you read online about shipping is generally how grim and how dangerous and how difficult it is. And it is, but for the majority, it's an incredible, amazing world to be in.
Yeah, I know before we spoke, you mentioned a lot of the data you get is actually from women at sea and females and things. So, yeah, I'd love to understand if there's any kind of trends you're seeing in terms of like female mariners and things.
Yeah, I think when we looked at it, I think we have one of the largest data sort of spreads of female seafarers, and that's from cruise liners to super yachts to commercial vessels as well, which is really interesting. I think the biggest challenge for women is that just the industry in general has never looked at it as a viable labour source. And actually, it's almost been sort of considered, we've exhausted all of our traditional labour sources, which would predominantly be male seafarers, again, legacy seafaring from particular parts of the world. And now there is this, with engineers, sort of officer qualifications, higher skilled labour. Perhaps we should introduce or really focus on women for diversity. And it's good that we're doing this as an industry, but again, doing it as a reactive, kind of idea is not always the best way of doing that. And so some of the very obvious concerns that we hear from females is, how am I going to manage having a family? How do I manage, being pregnant at sea? How do I manage menstruation? And that's always the thing that generally you hear the rhetoric. But I think there's probably also a really alternative sort of story to this, which we explored when we had this large data sample from females, was that there was absolutely no difference in the happiness of the vessel if you had women on board. So as long as you have, and you could probably relate this as well to nationalities on board. If you have one of something and they are the minority, that's a very difficult place to be, whether you're female, whether you're a particular nationality, or whether you have a particular religious belief. But if you have smaller groups of like-minded people, and within that would also be very similar populations. So if you have a small group of women, what happens is their kind of happiness increases based on that. So whilst there's this, perhaps concern that introducing women to vessels could be negative, if an owner does it responsibly and actually says, okay, well, instead of, introducing one woman onto one vessel, we're actually going to have a minimum of 3 or 4 or 5, that has absolutely zero detriment to the vessel. It's actually, it makes the vessel a happier place. And that's one of the really interesting things. So if you've got an owner that really invests in that idea and says, okay, it's not going to be across all of our vessels, but it will be across 10% of them, that's a really good way of, again, increasing your labour source with women.
Yeah, and I guess the challenge comes from finding the women to work on board, as long as you've got enough through the pipeline of people studying and training and things. And are you seeing more trends towards a greater increase of women coming through the ranks type of thing from schools and training?
So I think the fundamental issue is actually that the amount of availability for seafarers, because of the new building programs and the introductions of LNG vessels, we're in a bit of a labour shortage. So I think a lot of the kind of cadet schools and a lot of the owners and the managers looked at women as, this could be the golden bullet here. We could just open up our labour source to ladies, and actually we'll be able to fill the gap of the shortage. When actually that's not really the case, because actually what you need to do is, first, you've got a competency issue. You first of all need to recruit the right types of people rather than just recruiting for the sake of it. And I think an owner that really identifies what that is, is in a way kind of almost has first mover advantage. And I think this again, if we're sort of thinking about, well, then where do we find this competent labour from? When we then consider, we go onto Google and, is seafaring a good job? Again, when you're reading the sort of rhetoric of, well, actually, no, it's very difficult and, there's a lot of abuse, which again, there is. But again, that's the narrative of the story. It doesn't really encourage people, women, men, anybody to really consider seafaring as a career, because on the surface of it, it doesn't look attractive.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I guess you mentioned it earlier slightly about, okay, we looked at kind of the female aspect of your data that you've been collecting, and you talked about sort of some markets are slightly more kind of open to crew retention and things, and you said about the tanker and maybe sort of the other wet industries. Why is there a difference from what you're seeing, the dry markets, the containers, compared to the sort of the oil markets, if you don't mind me asking?
So in terms of the kind of the crew matrix or the competency?
Yeah, I think just, competency side, I guess, and retaining of the crew. Is there a difference between the different sort of types of vessels and the sectors?
Yeah, we think so. One of the fundamental problems with this, though, is getting data to actually support this. So probably as one of the clearest examples I can offer is that for British seafarers, there was a study which was done a number of years ago before COVID that suggested that generally a lot of British seafarers will generally stay on board a vessel for around 7 years. And then after that, they will leave seafaring. So you read that stat and you go, oh gosh, there's a big problem here, right? But the bits that then hide beneath that are, well, they might leave actual seafaring, but they often will come to shore. They might then work they might move into operations or technical, or they might become a DPA or whatever it might be. And I think that has sort of followed on a little bit from looking at the different types of vessels. So perhaps your dry bulk, tanker, wet cargo, sort of crewing. If you're a dry bulk master, to be able to move upwards to become a tanker master takes a number of years. It's a completely different competency. Yeah. And I think there was this big kind of belief that a lot of the dry bulk crew at some point would want to move over to the wet, because perhaps the money was better, the market conditions were better, the vessels themselves might have been more sophisticated, and there seemed to be more opportunity. But we need data to sort of really get a grasp of, is that true, or is that just the bias that we have? Because when we go to these beautiful conferences in Nice and we all sit around and we talk about it, two things happen. The first, that there's never any seafarers in the room. And if they are seafarers, they were seafarers 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and now they work at shore. And also, we haven't really invested in once we have that information, one, how do we get it? well, you can get it quite easily by asking. But then two, what do you then do with that information once you have it? So the answer is you would assume so, but it's very difficult to tell at this stage.
Has anyone, have you found kind of data around how you can try and support that transition from the sea to shore, do you find?
Yeah, so the majority of crew, like everyone, I think, again, we're talking about crew perhaps, or seafarers, like they're a special breed, and they are, they're very hardy, and they're professional, and they have a completely different personality. They're a lot more robust. But I think in any kind of workspace, people want to have a plan, right? You want to know that you start a job, that it's going to be equitable for you, that it's a job that you're going to enjoy. You want to get joy through your work. You want to build up a good community. You want to perhaps have a family, be supported by that. I think sometimes the planning isn't always there, and it's not the same for each owner. So each owner will have a different strategy for dealing with that, or worst case scenario, they don't. So sometimes managing that sort of ship to shore strategy, it's not always clear. And I think one of the clearest examples of that is around female seafarers. When they fall pregnant, what happens next? So again, depending on your nationality, probably also depending on the owner that you work with, there'll be a state, or you would hope that there would be some sort of state coverage. But generally, it really is dependent on your nationality, where your home is, and what vessel you're on, which then will almost dictate the kind of level of support you get throughout that. So the majority of people really just want a clear, robust plan.
Do you see many businesses offering kind of graduate programs, let's say, where you would spend initially, obviously, maybe shore-based to get the foundations of the business, then go at sea for 3 or 4 years with a guaranteed role back on shore? Is that common?
Yeah, sometimes. And what's really interesting, it's the one thing we always talk about with our data. So again, the majority of the owners that we work for are what you would call your very, your A-class owners. These are the guys that have really invested in a solution. They also invest in the data. So then you do sort of, you expect and you get some behaviors from that. So what we always suggest with the data that we get is, when you can prove that your vessels are operating safely, and you can prove that your vessels are operating more safer than that guy's over there, that's an amazing, sort of marketing ploy. Okay. Mm-hmm. you can use. And that's what that is like basically what we always encourage, using that for that whole sort of marketing purpose, really.
Yeah, and are there any specific things that you see regularly that the mariners themselves, they look for in the next voyage or the next vessel they want to go on? Like you mentioned, obviously, connectivity and things. Are there any other key things that really are very important to them?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that is sometimes overlooked, but, it's important to probably mention, are all of the soft stuff. So it's whether the owner, as well as having connectivity on board, also still invests in the crew's social interaction with each other. Because again, what we see is a lot of the kind of the crew managers will say, okay, well, the crew want and expect Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi, or some form of Wi-Fi package so that they can speak to their families, which is completely understandable. But they provide that as the solution. But actually what we find for our data is crews want an excuse, they want a reason to come together. And that might be sharing a beer, or that might be sharing a sort of a movie with each other, or, having a party on board, or sitting down for 5-10 minutes and sort of being in a space where they can talk. And actually sometimes the owners forget about that because they think, well, they've got the Wi-Fi, so they'll just sort of lock themselves away. And then it becomes sort of counterintuitive. So the crew are really interested in, I think, probably with the introduction as well, as, it's all becoming a lot more transparent, and being able to understand, different owner structures and flags, and how important it is for them when they're making the choice to work for the right owner. They want to understand that the owner that they work for is responsible. So they want all of that soft stuff. They want good trainings, they want good food, they want good welfare, they want the mental health line access, they want healthcare. And it's a lot of companies, if they have that, they're not always that good at, kind of displaying that to the open market, which is a real shame, really.
Yeah, I actually kind of first-hand experienced that when I was back in my shipbroking days. We used to go when we sold this vessel, we'd go for the closing, and then we'd go and actually regularly go on board the ships. And I was really surprised just to go into I don't know if it's called the rec room or the common room, just to find little things like a drum kit there and like a punch bag and stuff. And you forget about everyone, they have their hobbies and stuff at home, and like people like to take it on, I guess, obviously with them. So it was really great to see that. And I was just was really impressed by that sort of thing. And that was just a small little touch, would have meant a lot to me if I was in that situation.
Yeah,
so yeah,
it's amazing.
It's good. Okay, fantastic. So, I guess, just looking at a couple of other questions we kind of talked about before. In terms of the wider side of shipping, obviously we talked a lot about the owner's side. How do you see the charterers and maybe the classification societies, their role in improving the welfare of crew? Is that are you in touch with those people regularly as well?
I think the class and the charterers they're a huge component in this as well. As stakeholders, I think we all are, but the charterers for a number of years have been very concerned around the safety of the vessels. So you'll typically have, vetting inspectors so that a charterer can actually verify that the ship itself is safe and that the crew are competent. So they are totally invested in this. And I think that probably the charterers and the classification societies, I would say they're probably more on board with the data element side of this because they understand it, because they also understand fundamentally that they don't have a representative that's on board a vessel at any one time. So they're really reliant on third-party information to really guide them that these vessels are safe, that the crew are looked after, that the crew are competent, that the crew are working along the same values and ethics as the owner has. And if that's, zero harm, safety is paramount, they have the stop work culture, they need to be able to verify it. So with the data that we have, the charterers and the classification societies are really interested in that, because for them it's a secondary verification that they can then make better decisions. The one thing that we are always really mindful of is that the data that we produce and we have and we hold, that we don't misrepresent it, because actually what we look at is we work with an owner in a very bespoke manner. So we kind of take the challenges of what the owner might have, and that could be retention issues. They could have a large new building program and they need to expand their crewing side by 5-10%, and that's a huge amount of people that they need to find. And what you don't then want to do is then sort of muddy the waters by perhaps suggesting that a particular owner might have a particular issue in one thing because the data has sort of suggested it for that one particular project, so to speak. So we always say with anything that if we have a charter or we have a class, if someone asks us a question, we try and really unpick actually what are they actually trying to answer, and then to see whether that can then be backed up by the data.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and then I guess going forward, a few years from now, do you see any kind of big changes in as far as the industry or kind of like developments to help seafarers in different ways?
Yeah, I mean, I've always said it, and it's unfortunate in a way, but I think the real change to welfare and sort of long-term strategic change is always going to come through regulation and legislation. But we know in shipping how slowly that can work, and it's reactive and it's not proactive. From our perspective, we just see that it's education really, and it's just using actual unbiased data to really help the industry move forward. And the one thing I would really like to see in the next 5 years is actually a celebration of how amazing seafaring is, because it really is. As a profession, it opens up a huge gateway to the majority of those that are doing it. It's a sustainable industry. I've been in shipping for nearly 15 years, and I I can't ever see myself leaving it, and I don't want to. And I think we need to celebrate that a bit more. And I hope that perhaps, the legislators, the regulators, the charities, some of these large organisations can perhaps be a little bit more positive in that sense.
Yeah, no, I agree definitely, and especially with all the advances and investment on the technology side, it is a very exciting place. And so we spend a lot of the time, obviously, on the recruitment side. That's our main business, and we have placed a number of people that are ex-seafarers come on board, maybe help them join things like weather routing or voyage optimization businesses, that type of thing, or obviously more on the chartering side of technology. So I think advancements in tech is also offering lots of people later in their careers as well. So hopefully that's a win-win for both. And yeah, well, I think for now, yeah, it's a real pleasure to have you, Claire, on the show, Claire. And is there anything else you'd like to share about the business at all before we wrap things up?
I mean, I think it's really exciting what you just say, talking about recruitment wise. I think that's a really interesting thing because again, there's so much, rapid advancement with technologies and stuff. And again, I think the industry is very much, they're looking so far into the future, right? So we're now looking at, nuclear fusion and alternative fuels and, perhaps, decarbonisation. How do you solve that riddle? And then, moving even more forward, autonomous shipping and all of these other really exciting things. So again, the traditional model, perhaps, of what we've applied for the past 100 years, it doesn't necessarily, it's not that it should be forgotten, but it perhaps needs to be looked at again to see if are there any ways that we can move forward without losing the history, but equally not making the same mistakes or just applying really the same methodology, because it doesn't work anymore. So it does need to change. And what we don't want is we don't want to lose talent, I would say, and we don't want to lose good people that might perhaps, engineers, for example, instead of going into engineering for vessels, they go, actually, I might look at bridge engineering, building engineering, or I might look at it in my hometown of Manila or something like that, or moving into, kind of digital services, but again, outside of what traditionally they would have moved into, which would have been, seafaring or within shipping. And so that's, I think, where all the stakeholders, we all need to sort of pull together. So from recruitment to actual ship owning to shipbuilding, we all need to come together somehow and just sort of figure out what's the really important, what's going to keep us sustainable in 5 years, what's then going to keep us sustainable in 50 years, knowing we've got all these challenges coming in that we might also not actually have the expertise today to be able to deal with it. So it's really important. And the recruitment side of it is so important that you can blend different expertise together and sort of move people in different directions, because that's really needed.
Yeah, I find it might be a bit of an odd thing to say, but in a way, I feel like I think of the vessel almost as a person. You get the name of the ship, you like sister ships and stuff, but then you don't go a layer beneath that and think, nope, there's a chief officer, there's chief engineers and things. So it's almost like you need more promotion of the actual individuals themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And nothing will ever make you feel as old as you are until the vessel that you first fixed gets scrapped, and then you're
really?
oh man, that is bad. So you're like, I'm old, but yeah, it's they are the vessels themselves. They are people to some extent, but the people that are on the vessels are the most important asset. So we do probably need to reframe that. So we're not just looking at the still in its entirety and its worth, but we look at the human element that are the ones that operate that and protect that asset.
Yeah, and I do recommend it. People who maybe listen to this might have heard my episode with Carl King. I don't know, you may well know him, I'm sure you do. He's very prominent in the seafarer welfare space and marketing. And I really recommend speaking to him because he's got a fantastic network directly with the seafarers. And there's people like Chief McCoy, they have their own YouTube and their following and stuff. So it's a good insight if anyone's listening and wants to sort of learn a bit more about the journey and life of a seafarer, definitely. Cool. Okay, Claire. Well, thank you so much. And if anyone wants to reach out to you and learn more about the business, what's the best way for them to do so?
You can reach us at hello@PsyFyi or psyy-fyi.com or LinkedIn.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, well, before I let you go, I always like to ask people like what they like to get up to in their spare time if they have any. So yeah, as far as like hobbies and things outside of work, what do you tend to spend your time doing?
Oh God, I'll give you some context for this. So I used to be a very avid runner and skier. So in my early 20s, I used to love it. But my probably lack of fitness and, sort of too many beers, après-ski beers, led to me doing really bad damage to my knees.
Dear.
Generally what I do these days is I spend a lot of time in the gym trying to sort of build up my strength muscles. And I actually recently started playing snooker. So
oh wow, okay, that's interesting, right?
Mental chess, as they say.
Yeah.
But it's quite interesting. It's hard. It's really hard. And a lot of snooker balls are really hot.
Just the size of the tables, they're so much longer than you think, and it's a great game. My cousin was very sort of successful at snooker, and they had actually owned a club, their family and stuff. We used to play it a lot. So yeah, very interesting. I never thought that one.
Well, amazing. So the next time you're in London, we can have a game together. So
yeah,
I can't report to being good, but
no problem. You'll probably thrash me. But anyway, Claire, it's a real pleasure to have you on the show. And if anyone wants to have any more questions, please feel free to reach out to her. But for now, thank you for tuning in, everyone, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thanks, Callum. Bye.
You're welcome. Thank you.